Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Dolan. I saw on your website today that you've issued an update to the reopening of the investigation into the Pell Air accident.
Yes, Senator.
Could you just give the committee in this forum a brief on the status of that reopened investigation?
At this stage, the update, Senator, related to the contract that I said I signed last week. The information gathering stage of the reopened investigation is essentially complete, and so the work is now going through to assess all the additional information that's been acquired to draw conclusions so that a draft report can be prepared before Christmas.
Okay, so information gathering stage I'd like to go to. Going back to an answer to a question on notice that you took at the time of the original investigation, you said that the Chamber's report, I quote, "The Chamber's report does not contain any new evidence that organisational factors were likely to have contributed to the accident." You go on to say the Chamber's report reflects what was separately reported and available to the ATSB in the reports of CASA's accident investigation and special audit. Now, I challenged that at the time.
Yes, Senator.
And so do your Canadian peers who've done an independent peer review, who've made numerous reports or numerous comments in their report that in actual fact systemic organisations, regulatory systemic issues to do with the organisation, oversight of the organisation by CASA were significant and were omitted, and they go into some detail about the process within your organisation that resulted in those being omitted, even though they were significant. Can you provide me an assurance that the rework of this report will be considering the quite detailed information contained not only in the special audit but in the Chamber's report and in the fatigue report that go to the heart of how the individual ended up having that accident?
Yes, Senator, I can give you that assurance. We have acquired from CASA not just the various reports, but the core material they relied on to prepare those reports as part of the process of undertaking the reopened investigation.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that cooperation. Could you also comment on whether you still stand by the remarks that you made in the questions of notice?
I'm not in a position to comment on that, Senator, until I see the results of the reopened investigation. It's entirely possible, and the Canadians have already alluded to this, that we did not give sufficient weighting as an organisation to the organisational aspects of this investigation, and that is what we hope we can determine through the reopened investigation.
Okay. There's a couple of points that come out of this, Mr Dolan, in that there's one about the trust of industry in the organisations that are supposed to be having an oversight around safety and regulation, but the other is the very real impact on people. Now, at the time, the committee was concerned about what we saw as a breakdown in the relationship between yourselves and CASA and the inadequacies of the report. Subsequent to the Canadian peer review, which was quite scathing about the fact there were very clear systemic issues which were not addressed, my understanding is that as people who've been affected by this accident, being the pilot involved and potentially the nurse, who have sought some remedy for the situation they find themselves in as a result of this report, and in the pilot's case, correspondence I've seen from him has indicated that that report has essentially finished his aviation career. And my understanding is that even after the Canadian report, when he has sought an act of grace payment from the Department of Finance, that ATSB's recommendation is don't pay it, it was his fault. Can you confirm that was the case?
I don't recall. I recall that there was some information sought from the Department of Finance in relation to an act of grace payment. We provided the facts as we understood them. It's not a purpose of our organisation to assign blame, Senator, and we would not have said that to the Department of Finance.
Advice that Senator Fawcett has asked you for.
Can
you table that advice?
I don't see any reason why we shouldn't, so I'll obtain it and table it for the committee.
Okay, thank you. In the light of the Canadian report, which indicates there were very clear systemic failures on behalf of the company and in terms of CASA's oversight, and so the whole concept of system safety is that whilst the pilot was the last link in the chain, these other considerations had a significant impact, which was borne out by the fact the company had to cease operations after these investigations until remedial measures were put in place. With that now on the public record, with this new focus, would you consider providing the Department of Finance with alternate advice if he were to come back and seek some compensation for the fact that as a direct result of the report that your organisation issued, with all of the failings and how that was put together, his career has essentially been finished and all the financial loss that's gone with that?
It's not a matter that I can answer on the spot here, Senator. I'm happy to turn my mind to that if any such request going forward.
That would be very useful.
Do you
I
think
will
it's
look forward to the
inappropriate
report.
I reckon you're getting off pretty light. I mean, so we'll be very interested in that.
Do you think it's inappropriate, through you, Chair, Mr Dolan, do you think it's inappropriate that you provide any opinion as to the appropriateness of an act of grace payment to the pilot involved, given your involvement in this particular matter, that there might be an issue of apprehended bias on your part and on the part of the ATSB, that it really should be a matter that the ATSB either needs to get someone independent to comment on or not comment on it at all?
I'm between a rock and a hard place here, Senator. I'm being urged on the one hand to
Senator, if through the administration of the Act of Grace process, the department is asked to provide some advice, that would not be an unusual process, I have to say. But during the administration of the Act of Grace payment, there would be advice sought from a number of areas. And at the end of the day, that decision is a discretionary decision for the person making the decision.
But you understand,
I understand
Minister,
it very
the
well.
importance of the ATSB advice on this, and if the advice was a thumbs down to the pilot, that could be quite damaging to the Act of Grace, and I'm very grateful for Senator Fawcett to raise this issue.
Senator, having administered that before myself previously, there are a range of pieces of advice sought, and it is a discretion of the decision maker at the end of the day.
But we will get a copy of that advice. I think Mr Dolan was good enough to indicate that we would get a copy of that advice to this committee as to what was said, in all the correspondence in relation to that. I've got a couple of questions, Chair, but I don't want to interrupt.
Perhaps further questions around that process probably should go back through the Department of Finance.
My last comment is that the other person deeply involved in this, or the other two people, I guess, is the person who was the patient on the flight, and particularly the nurse, and part of the mental anguish that those families have suffered is the clear disconnect between the facts as have been laid out for all the public to see through that Senate inquiry and the position that ATSB has taken. So I hope, Mr Dolan, for the sake...
no longer alive.
Yeah, I know that. But for the sake of everyone involved, and particularly those who are still with us, that this will be a fair and accurate report of responsibilities that led to the situation where, rightly or wrongly, the pilot did what he did, but very clearly it is a result of a system failure, regulator, company and individual, not just the individual as that original report stated. Anyway, thanks, Chair.
All right, look, we're going to go till 7. We're finished with ATSB and we call...
Sorry, very quickly.
Right, hurry.
Who's first? Okay. How many accidents have there been in Australia in 2014-15?
Take one on notice, Senator.
That's fine. When you let us know, could you please let CASA know as well? Because they've got a question on notice that depends on your answer to that question. And they say they can't get it out of you.
Just very quickly, and taking on notice, Mr Dolan, I've asked the issue about the REPCON on communications. This is about issues, concerns about a loss of separation assurance between Essendon and Melbourne. A real criticism from people within the aviation community about the ATSB relying on WebTrack, something that publicly available that a lot of kids use to track where aircraft are. Can you, on notice, provide details of what has happened with respect to investigation in relation to the loss of separation assurance, whether there will be any further reports in respect of that, whether you've reconsidered your views on that, because there was a concern that for several hours there was a lack of adequate communication between Melbourne and Essendon Towers in respect of aircraft movements where they could have potentially intersected.
That's on notice.
That's on notice.
Thank you.
And the other one on notice relates to the double go-around on July the 5th. If you could tell us where the ATSB is on that in relation to that double
Currently
go-around.
undertaking an investigation of that double go-round, Senator.
Yeah, so might take several weeks or months before there's a report on it.
Months, more than
Months.
weeks, Senator,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Thank you. David Forster's got one and then we're done.
Nobody else?
No, come on.
Mr Dolan, since we last spoke on the topic of colour vision deficiency and the pilot cohort, whom we have many in Australia, could you take on notice, have there been any incidents, safety-related incidents or accidents attributable to a pilot with a colour vision deficiency?
We previously answered that question on notice, Senator, I think about a year ago, and we have
Yes,
had
and
no,
I'm saying,
and we've had no notification
since we last spoke, have there been any?
Thank you.
No,
So
Senator.
I'm certainly not aware of it.
ATSB can go home. We now want